Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody back uh, from break. Hope you all had a chance to rest, recharge, spend some time with family, maybe. But if nothing else, just have some time away from school, just sort of get ourselves ready for our second semester here. And to open the second semester, we're going to go through this very brief lecture that you can see the title here is A New American Era. Now, a couple of housekeeping notes. One is that you all should have the link to the Pear Deck slides. That should be turned on to student pace mode, as always. And you guys have done this now at least once, maybe twice. Make sure that you are, as you're taking your notes, that you are on the correct slide, um, just for your organizational purposes. You can go forward or go backwards at your own pace, but you also do so at your own peril, as I don't want you to get off at all with what we're talking about here. Secondly, is I will be checking these to make sure that you followed along, that you have been taking your notes. At any point, if you're watching this corporately together as a class, you need whoever the sub is to pause this lecture so that maybe you can get caught up. Please just raise your hand. Please let them know. Or if you're watching this on your own, obviously you can pause and sort of go at your own pace in that regard as well. Also, you'll have a couple of assignments moving forward that will sort of take off from this point. This point being when this lecture ends. So if you missed a day, if you missed that first day back, you might want to let the sub know, and they may be able to point you in the right direction. Probably either you know, giving you access to the video while everybody else is working on the next assignment or what have you. But the next assignment is going to sort of build off of this. So it's going to be kind of important that you at least have some exposure to this material. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and dive right into A New American Era. And the big question that you have in front of you, and the question facing this new independent American nation, is now what? In a lot of ways, and we touched on this before break, American independence was a surprise, and many may even say a shock around the world, both internationally. So other nations kind of shocked that Britain just sort of gave up. Again, we talked about that at the end of the fall semester, that really Britain didn't get beat as much as they just decided that it was no longer worth the fight. But even that was a shock around the world to foreign powers. But then there was even some shock domestically here within what is now the United States. At that time, the former British colonies. A little bit of shock that this had actually taken place. Again, we talked about it, that actually American patriots, those who wanted independence, were actually in the numerical minority. There was, if nothing else, a majority of people who were apathetic, who didn't much care. Yes, the British government is being a little bit tyrannical, but life for the most part is pretty good. On either extreme, there were your independently minded patriots, but then there were also your loyalists. So really, there was a lot of shock, even here within the United States, a place that had fought for their freedom and independence, and that serves as setup for this sort of unsurprising notion that there's going to be a lot of experimentation with regard to how this new nation, we don't even really have a name yet, is going to govern itself. The United States finds its independence, is given its independence at a really interesting time, where you have sort of these Enlightenment ideals that question divine right of kings, coupled with free market, economics. There's just a lot of different sort of things going on. Very interesting time for a nation to gain its independence. And so it is in that vein where, within the Enlightenment, we're looking to, sort of dispel that divine right of kings, that business look, the people need to have, power ultimately in government. It's in that sort of area of, in spirit of experimentation that the Second Continental Congress meets in 1777. And it is worth pointing out that the war is not only still going on, as it points out, but quite frankly, the war is really just getting underway. You're less than 18 months into this conflict, and you have the Second Continental Congress that meets. Now, we talked about the First Continental Congress. That was really more of just sort of a high-minded, representation of the colonists. It did not have any sort of governmental power. It was not a government, right? It wasn't really even a military body. It was just sort of a representative body. The Second Continental Congress, it's worth noting, this is really our first governmental body. Now, that doesn't mean that it has much in the way of power, because it does not. There's really a lot of confusion as to really who's in charge and what really even being in charge means. Now, they passed this thing called the Articles of Confederation, which we're going to talk about here in a second. Now, just because the members of the Continental Congress, of the Second Continental Congress, passed the Articles of Confederation, that doesn't really mean that it has any power yet. And we're going to find out that it's actually not going to be until well into the 1780s before that phrase "Articles of Confederation" really has any power at all. But there are efforts. I sort of posed that question flippantly. Now what? There was some thought put into it as to, if we win this war, what's things going to look like? There was some thought put into it, but not near as much as you may think, and certainly there was not very much in the way of agreement. Okay, now the Articles of Confederation themselves, they're really, again, it's a good attempt. It's good in principle, and you find that a lot of things are good in principle, or they're good on paper, but then in practice they're really not. They're really not what you're after. And there's a ton of different issues, and I haven't listed these on the slide, but I am going to talk through a couple of them here really quick that you're going to want to jot down there in your notes field. It all comes back to that core issue of that's up there, is that it's basically a not only a league of friendship, quote unquote, but a loose league of friendship. There's not really, as you could imagine, this huge desire on the part of these new states, we'll call them, for lack of a better term. There's not a ton of willingness on the part of these states and the citizens therein to give over a lot of power to a central government, right? And this is understandable, right? Especially for those patriots who hated Britain, detested all the Townshend Acts and the Tea Acts and the Intolerable Acts and all that. Their view was those things came from a centralized government. So now that we've fought a war, essentially a civil war, to get rid of one centralized government, why would we give a whole lot of power to another centralized government? There's a great line for those of you that have seen the movie The Patriot. No, we will not watch it in class, but if you've seen the movie The Patriot, the main character has this great line. Really, it's at the beginning of the movie where he says, "Why would I trade one tyrant 3,000 miles away for 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away?" And he's coming at this question. He's coming at the question of the war for independence, really from the loyalist side, saying, "Look, yeah, there's this tyrant who's 3,000 miles away, but he's at least one tyrant who's 3,000 miles away. If we get rid of Britain, we're going to have 3,000 tyrants tyrants. Every man is going to become his own tyrant, and they're all going to be 1 mile away. They're going to be right in my backyard. And again, that's a little bit outside of the time frame that we're talking about, but that's sort of the sentiment, right? Is we've gotten rid of that one tyrant. We don't want to have to deal with, maybe it's not 3,000, but if we're one of the 13 states, we don't want to deal with the other 12, right? Um, and because of that, there's a ton of different issues, and these are the things that you really need to write down and make sure that you pay attention to. Um, One is that there essentially is no unified national government, right? And it says that, I know it says that there uh, in that second large bullet point, but that's the first of the key issues, is that there's really no central government framework within the Articles of Confederation, right? So some of the smaller issues then held there within then. Um, the central government has no power to raise an army. The central government has no power to collect taxes, which economically becomes very, very difficult now to start paying back those war debts that we owe to, those European powers like France, who really essentially won the revolution for us. There is no there's no framework to regulate commerce, to regulate, remember that word commerce means trade. There's no framework to regulate commerce between the states. There's no framework to regulate commerce between the states and foreign powers. Um, there's really there's no framework set up to solve any disputes between the states, not just trade disputes, but land disputes. There's nothing to solve any of those issues. Um, the tax, I started with, I guess I started with military, but you know, the power to tax, it really, in terms of collecting revenues to pay off those war debts, it becomes well, donate whatever money that you feel like you're able to, various states, and so that leads to a lot of animosity between the states, because you have those New England states like Massachusetts, like New York, like Connecticut, Rhode Island, who were really at the heart of the revolution. Those were a few of the states that held a majority of the patriots. But then you had states like Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina who really were far more loyalist. And so when there's this call of, hey, donate whatever you want, they don't really feel the need to give a lot of money to this new Confederate government. Um, and so that leads to a lot of hurt feelings, right? The New England colonies are, representatives for the New England colonies are going to say, hey, we all fought for our independence. Now we all should share in the burdens of independence, and those southern states are going to say we didn't really want independence in the first place. So there's a lot of animosity built up. The military, one of the big issues that's going to get pointed out later is that this leaves this new nation very, very weak, right? Because you're relying on individual state militias, and we're going to come to this here in a moment, that a lot of times these state militias can't even handle issues within their own states, let alone if you were to have an outside power, say Great Britain, who still has territorial holdings in Canada. If Great Britain were to decide to attack again, it would be devastating, right? So there are a ton of issues. This idea of a league of friendship, that's essentially what a confederacy is, right? And I sort of glossed over that. A confederacy is where you have um, several smaller governments who only allowed the central government certain powers, right? Instead of instead of having the central power as sort of the hub where power is then delineated out. It's a league of friendship, and it doesn't go over very well, and it is in a lot of ways doomed to failure from the start. Now, before we get into sort of what brings this whole house of cards crashing down, there are a couple of major successes. First of all, it does lay the groundwork for the Constitution, which we're going to get into tomorrow, Monday, and then on into next week. At least the colonists could get together and kind of agree on this, right? Um, you have to start somewhere, and the articles, while they are kind of a failed document from the start, the articles provide at least a starting point, right? The other success, and this is something that we see moving into even today in 2019, I guess 2020, when you all are taking these notes, is that they do agree on this thing called the Land Ordinance of 1785. And if you've ever wondered how we get our township system today, but by the way, the township system is how the land is divided up within a county. It comes from that Land Ordinance of 1785. That ordinance, and an ordinance, by the way, is essentially a law. That law is really the only thing that survives from the Articles of Confederation because it does actually make a lot of sense. And it's basically how are we going to divide up the land in the West that we now have control of, right? Because you got to remember, it's no longer just the 13 states now. You also have all of this territory spanning all the way to the Mississippi River. And the Land Ordinance of 1785 really just touches Ohio, but it's going to become key moving forward in terms of dividing land up. This is a system that we're going to go back to over and over and over again. And if you ever looked at a map of any county in not just the state of Indiana, but really any state in the Union, that is where we get the township system, which is just kind of something interesting. That this stuff does have implications moving into the 21st century. Now, some international woes. This again, internationally, this quote defeat of the British end quote is a stunner. Not a lot of people saw that happening, but be that as it may, the articles or the the American states, they're really just a backwater, and by that, of course, we mean they're not really all that important. The European powers just absolutely, basically ignored them. Britain basically just refused to recognize them, acted like they didn't even exist. Spain, who has territorial holdings in Florida and then everything to the west of the Mississippi River, they they're openly hostile. They see this as perhaps an opportunity to expand. France had essentially done what they wanted to do with regard to Britain, right? They wanted to sort of get back at Britain for their defeat in the 7 Years' War, and they had done that. And now they had their own issues. And quite honestly, the French were mainly interested in us because of our war debt. I've mentioned the French Revolution before. It's a fascinating period in world history, and again, sort of adds to that ferment that our nation is founded in. But the French Revolution takes off in a lot of ways because France helped us win our independence. France, by helping us in defeating quote unquote the British, they basically bankrupt their entire economy, right? So in terms of French interest in us, all they're really interested in is, hey, you got to repay your war debts because if you don't, we're going to go bankrupt. France goes bankrupt. So you could probably take a pretty good guess as to what happened in terms of us repaying our war debt. It didn't really happen. Now, in addition to all of that, any trade, we're having to deal with pirates on the open seas. This was something that our forefathers really hadn't had to deal with before because, again, they had the protection of the British Navy. So they have to figure out how to deal with pirates now. And they still have to deal with natives in the West, right? One of the big sort of reasons for the revolution is, the whole proclamation line of 1763. Americans, the colonists at that time, still wanted to expand west, and Britain said, no, not yet. Now they have to deal with it, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on that this new country is sort of stepping into. Now, again, this whole Articles of Confederation thing was doomed from the start, and it doesn't really take that long. There's a ton of infighting, and we touched on that early. Mainly, it has to do with economics. Another thing is currency. There is no standard currency in this new country, so there's also currency disputes. What is the value of the Virginia state currency in places like North Carolina, in places like New York? Who determines what that currency is worth? There's really nothing. There's nothing to regulate that. And then what happens is, because there's no regulations on taxation, we have Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. And you can kind of see that there. I know the bottom point is a little bit obscured by the screen recorder, but I think you can see it on your screens. Revolutionary War captain by the name of Daniel Shays is a debt-ridden farmer, meaning that he's got a lot of debt in Massachusetts. Sparing the gory details on debt, basically these farmers would have to borrow large sums of money to purchase farms, but then also to purchase supplies to actually run their farms. The state of in this case, the state of Massachusetts had issued paper money. That they had they wanted the farmers rather wanted lightened taxes, because the taxes had become so exorbitantly high that their farms were going bankrupt. They were losing their farms. And then they also wanted to suspend property takeovers. Basically, you can't take our farms because this is ridiculous, right? We have all these taxes, and the state is not providing means for us to actually get out of this hole. And so there's a rebellion led by this guy named Daniel Shays. Now there's hundreds of these rebels, if you want to call them that, around the state that they're going to enforce their demands, or at least attempt. They actually take over at least one, maybe two county courthouses, and hold some state officials hostage. Massachusetts authorities, they respond. They actually raise a small army. There are skirmishes. You can see it down there. I believe the number's three. Three of these Shayite, just referring to somebody who participates in this rebellion, are killed and wounded. One is wounded, and at that point the movement collapses. But we can already see here that this is not working, right? Massachusetts has no guidance. They have no recourse. They have no idea what they're doing. And people now are starting to pay the price with their lives, right? And it's one thing if people are paying their lives, paying the price of their life in defense of something like liberty. But when they start dying over, taxes and, property being taken over in their own backyards at the hands of their neighbors, in some cases, that's something that makes people sort of stand up and take notice, right? So this is now where we get, and you see that there, reveals a need for change. The upper classes really are scared into what we now call the Constitutional Convention. That word aghast, they just can't believe this. And this, again, the international politics, the international nature of the world at this time. Haiti, I believe, is going through what's called the Haitian Rebellion at this point, or somewhere right in that time frame. And the upper classes are scared to death at the thought of what's called a debtor rebellion, right? Where you have these indebted classes who are going to start rising up violently. And this just absolutely scares the upper class to death. The debtor classes are fed up with, inconsistent state governments. People in Massachusetts, they don't understand why they're paying higher taxes than the people in, say, the neighboring state of New York. They hear that down in Virginia, they're paying even lower taxes. So there's a ton of frustration on both sides of this sort of class divide, and really all over this new area that used to be the British colonies. And this is now where we come to the Constitutional Convention, which is what your assignment tomorrow is going to have you look at. Now, I don't have a time with me as to how long um, this lecture is. I know it's within a class period, so make sure that you have all of your notes done. I will try to, if I can remember, finalize these notes and get those posted for you by tomorrow, so that you can sort of look back on them as you need to, or if you need to. But tomorrow you will have an assignment that will sort of bring your attention to the Constitutional Convention. So with that, we're going to call it quits here, and I'll see you guys in a few days.